The man who made valvular heart surgery possible in the first place, beyond doubt, was Walton Lillehei. Walton Lillehei was an American surgeon who pioneered open heart surgery. Remember, without the help of cardiopulmonary bypass, it would not be possible to implant a valve. And at that time, the only way a valve could be implanted was by implanting it into the peripheral aorta for the treatment of aortic regurgitation. So he was the one who started all this. And he then developed different heart valves, which led to developments that we see today. What are the topics that I will be discussing in this chapter? First of all, which type of prosthetic valves are available in the first place? How can we detect them with the help of echo? And how can we determine which valve was implanted? Then I'll discuss the different complications of prosthetic valves. And finally, a very important issue in modern cardiovascular surgery, mitral valve repair. Prosthetic valves are very similar to cookies. There are a million different types out there, but in general, they all taste very much the same. They're all sweet. And everybody and every surgeon has their individual preference. In this chapter, I'll give you a brief overview of the currently used or most commonly used prosthetic valves. However, keep in mind, just as new cookies are being created and brought out on the market, so are prosthetic valves. Here's a list of the different prosthetic valves that we will be discussing in this chapter. However, keep in mind that not every valve can be put in every position. You will find this diagram also in your fact sheets. First, let's talk about mechanical valves. Mechanical valves consist of a metal case, usually a metal which is very strong but still very light, such as, for example, carbon, and leaflets or discs which can close and open. In addition, we have a sewing ring which allows us to attach the prosthetic valve then to the organic tissue of the heart. From an engineering perspective, artificial heart valves are absolutely fascinating constructions, considering that a valve has to close and open approximately 1 billion times within its lifespan, which is approximately 25 years. So these valves have to be very durable, and to test the wear and tear of such valves, special machines are used. And these machines continuously open and close the valve at very high frequencies of over 1,000 cycles per minute. And this is important because the FDA requires a valve to be tested in over 600 million cycles. And in reality, mechanical valves are very, very durable. Very infrequently do we see some form of structural defect of a mechanical valve. Of course, there are very many different models of mechanical valves. Every company has their own model, or more than one model actually. But in general, we can classify 3 different types of mechanical valves: the ball cage valve, the tilting disc type, and the bileaflet valves. The ball cage valve consists of a ball which moves freely within a housing and thereby either obstructs the opening or lets blood flow through the opening. Then we have the tilting disc, where we have only one disc which is asymmetrically mounted on the prosthesis, so that blood can flow from both sides, from one chamber to the other. And then finally we have the bileaflet disc, which consists of 2 leaflets which open and close, so that we have blood flow on the left, on the right, and also between the 2 discs. The disadvantage of mechanical valves is that we have to use anticoagulation. The advantage is that these valves are very durable. In contrast to mechanical valves, biological valves use actual tissue. The tissue which is most frequently used is either pig aortic valve tissue or bovine pericardium. The valves consist of a ring where we can attach the sutures to, struts, and the biological tissue which is mounted on these struts. The form and function of these biological valves is similar to a normal aortic valve. In other words, we have a semilunar valve. In addition to the stented biological valves, we also have stentless valves. These valves seem to have a better flow profile. However, it is still unclear if these valves show any benefit with respect to outcome and what the durability of these valves really is. In any case, the material which is now most used is pericardium. The big advantage of biological valves is the fact that we do not need anticoagulation. The disadvantage is that they are less durable. A special form of biological prosthesis is the so-called valve and stent. What kind of a valve is that? Well, it's a valve that is basically used for the percutaneous approach to implant aortic valves. It is a valve which is located within a stented case. There's two different types, the so-called Edwards sapiens valve and the core valve at the moment, where we either inflate this valve in the aortic position with the help of a balloon, or where we have some form of self-expanding material which kind of expands and thereby opens up and unfolds. Such type of valves are now also being developed for conventional surgery. There you would also inflate the balloon and thereby place the valve in the aortic position. The only difference to the percutaneous approach is that in this case you would first cut the old valve out before you put the new valve in. Other forms of tissue valves are homo and autografts. A homograft is a human valve which is explanted from a cadaver, where we use special techniques of preservation and then reimplant it into a patient. An autograft is a human pulmonic valve which is explanted and then reimplanted in the same patient but in the aortic position. This type of operation is also called the Ross procedure or the switch operation. Homografts, or allogenic aortic valves, as they are also called, can also be harvested from transplant recipients. The advantage of such valves is that they can be used successfully if we have some form of aortic root involvement. This happens, for example, in endocarditis or in patients who have aortic root disease. In addition, they are also successfully used if we have prosthetic valve failure and if we need some form of reoperation. Another advantage of homografts is that they do not need anticoagulation and they seem to have a very good flow profile. And finally, the last type of prosthesis I'd like to show you is a so-called composite graft. Here we have a combination of an artificial valve, usually a mechanical valve, with an aortic root replacement. The material is usually Dacron which is used. A composite graft is implanted if we have the combination of an aortic valve problem, for example stenosis or regurgitation, with an aortic root problem such as dilatation, aneurysm or dissection. The challenge here is to reimplant the coronary arteries. There are several techniques how the coronary arteries can be reimplanted, such as the Bentel or Cabrol method. Let me now go back to the table I presented way at the beginning of this presentation and answer the question, which prosthesis can be used in which position? In principle, more valvular types are available for the aortic position opposed to the mitral, tricuspid, or the pulmonic valve. For the mitral valve, we can only use the stented biological valves and the mechanical valves. The same is true for the tricuspid valve. However, there we do not like to use mechanical valves. We only use those if we don't have any other option. And finally, in the pulmonic valve, basically what is almost always used is a homograft. This table gives you a brief overview of the various models which are available, which are most commonly used, and also when they were first introduced. You can see that the first type of valve which was used was the so-called Starr-Edwards ball cage valve, which was first implanted 1965. Such ball cage valves are not implanted anymore. Now we only see tilting disc and bileaflet valves. It's very important to know which type of valve the patient has and also which model. Why? We'll talk later. Here's a list of the biological valves, the porcine valves, the pericardial valves, ranging from the Hancock standard all the way to the Toronto stentless valve and the freestyle valve to the CE Baxter valve. And in conclusion, here are the homo and autologous valves which are commercially not available. You will find all these tables in your fact sheets.
So in summary, there are a lot of different prosthetic valve models out on the market, and new models are being developed constantly. No question, it's a very big market. My suggestion would be that you have a list of the different prosthetic valves which are available in your laboratory for reference purposes. Next will be a chapter where we'll be discussing how we can recognize the different models with the help of echocardiography.